excited to see people from across the globe joining us. Thank you for taking time out of your days, whether it's early morning or late evening, to join us. We really appreciate it, and hope that you find these sessions interesting and informative. So we're just waiting, for those who are just joining us, we're just waiting for Karina to come back. She was having some problems with her video, so she wanted to come back. We will introduce Mike Robinson, who will be our second speaker after Karina has finished her presentation. Both Karina and Mike, as I've said, were set to be keynotes at this year's Atlas Annual Conference, which was going to be held in Prague. Obviously, the coronavirus pandemic has meant that we weren't able to hold the conference, but Ambis and Prague have kindly co-hosted a number of events with us this week, and Mike and Karina have both agreed to do short keynote presentations. Karina, you're back. Any luck?
I am back, and I've allowed my camera to work, but I don't know why it's not working.
No, it's not working.
Yeah.
Do you have a presentation that you wanted to show? Do you want to send it to me and I can put it up? And
nope, I just was thinking to just have my face there.
Okay.
So everything's just working out brilliantly for me.
Karina,
I don't know what.
Karina,
yes.
Sometimes happens that if you hide your camera, usually that you forgot to unhide it. So manually, I mean, if you use something on the camera. No?
Yeah, I'm not really, it was working before when I was testing it, and of course now it's not. I don't know if maybe we could leave the floor to Mike Robinson, and I could maybe try to see if I could work something out.
Mike, would you be happy with that? Is that okay?
Yeah, I'd be happy with that. Yes, no problem, Tara.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you everyone for your patience. In that case, let me go on to introduce Mike Robinson. Mike is a professor at the University of Birmingham in the UK. He's also the director of the Ironbridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage, which is a long-standing partnership between the Ironbridge Gorge World Heritage Site and the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust. He has worked on tourism and heritage projects in over 40 countries for over 30 years, and has been an advisor for the UNESCO World Heritage Programme, and has worked closely with the European Commission and many other state agencies and NGOs across the globe. So Mike, many thanks for joining us and for taking the time out of your day. And if I can hand over to you, I will ask you to present. I will keep a general eye on the time, and I'll send you a quick message when you're getting close to about 20 minutes, but don't worry too much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tara, and good morning, everybody, or morning or evening or wherever you are. Let me try and share my screen because I want to talk through some slides. So if you just give me this. Oops. Can everybody see that? You can see that? Can somebody say yes, no, yes?
Yes, we can.
Yes, yep.
Yeah. Wonderful, okay. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to Prague. Prague looks very much like my living room at the moment, but never mind. You've asked me to speak for 20 minutes. I'm not sure what I can tell you in 20 minutes, but I'll do my best. And it seems very strange, I think, speaking about tourism at this time when tourism effectively doesn't exist in the form that we all know it. And then thinking again, I was thinking about what to talk about in the broad theme, and I'm thinking, well, really, maybe I'm not discussing tourism, but I'll leave that for you to decide. I want to do in sort of a two-part presentation, and I'm not sure that parts actually sort of gel together fully, but hopefully you'll see the links. But I want to start with this image, which I've used quite often, and it's an image of deep space taken by the Hubble telescope, showing distant galaxies. And I've often used this image as a metaphor for the tourism sector, for the tourist, and indeed the tourism researcher, because I think we're all drawn to the bright lights, the shiny destinations, the core locations, the attractive places where things happen and people want to be. And this is understandable. This is how tourism works. And it's arguably how we work as people. We are drawn to the beautiful, we are drawn to the peaceful, we're drawn to the accessible. And also, as I used to tell my grad students, we are as researchers, we are drawn to these places. We like to be we like to do our case studies in the nice places around the world, the already established tourist destinations and the places we like to visit. But actually what this image also shows us, if we look, are the dark spaces, the places in between, the hidden places, the out of sight places, which are there nonetheless. And in tourism terms, these are the places that don't sparkle. These are the places we don't go to, or even that we don't even know about. And it's certainly the places that we are generally less attracted to as researchers. Now, when I read the introductory words for this this event, it just sort of made me problematize the theme a little bit more. And it's a very apposite theme in these very strange times. And it also made me reflect upon sort of over 30 years of sort of trying to work out what tourism is all about. And the theme itself points to the existence of these so-called dark spaces, the margins, the outer regions, and the extent to which tourism can make a difference in economic terms and social terms to these places. And I'm going to start by just giving you an example from my hometown. And I use my hometown because I feel I can denigrate it in a way that I can't denigrate anywhere else. And this is my hometown. It's a town called Sunderland. It's on the northeast coast of England. And it was once a very bright place indeed. It was connected to the world through industry and trade. And this aerial image was taken at the time when I was growing up, maybe in the mid 60s. And it was a town of life and wealth. At one point, it was the largest shipbuilding town in the world, leading in marine engineering and glass production, had its own fishing fleet, and it even had its own vibrant tourist resort. Everything you see in this photograph indicates to me wealth and activity, vibrancy, and a sense of pride. Now, Sunderland still has a nice beach. This is selectively shown in the tourist promotions that still sort of happen around the town. But everything else in this image is gone over a period of 40 years. And despite some opportunities and some initiatives to develop tourism in this city, it's very much a marginal place. And for me, and for many other people who remember just how bright a place it was, it's now a very dark place indeed. And of course, I'm being selective here with the images, but no more selective than showing you a picture of a pristine beach. The photograph that is on the top left is one of the main high streets of a city, my city of over 350,000 people. It's not a very attractive place at all. And still within the policy discourse of development, of regional development, of tourism development, there's a frequent tone of salvation. There's a frequent tone that tourism will create the jobs. It will create the benefits that flow from what we understand as the sort of the touristic system. And it's that sort of advocacy, which we're all aware of, that catches the attention of the local politicians. And often out of quite sheer desperation for some places. They're looking for that development package, that tourism-led development package, that quick fix, which is, you can read as the you know, what they can do within their term of office for politicians. And for me, these are the dark places. These are the regions, the marginal places, which we really don't give enough attention to. The promise of tourism, as the promise of any single action, I guess, continues to be very hollow in many cases. And at the same time, I've learned that we can't be too hard on tourism. How can we mend places, broken places? How can we change people's lives through any single action? And I've just put on the slide there that tourism can never be expected to address problems that are deep-rooted and, in a sense, hyper-complex. The result of many decades, in some cases centuries, of change. And this raises the question, which is also part of the theme here, about collaboration. Because regional development, particularly of the sorts of regions and places that I'm sort of trying to identify for you here, requires collaboration across all policy sectors. But I don't see that happening. And I would argue that the reality remains that the real significant drivers for regional development in a majority of cases don't come and won't come from tourism. They come from a bigger package of development. Now, recognizing the nature of these immense problems faced by marginal regions, whether it's in my hometown or whether it's more pressingly in the lesser developed world, is a start. Just being able to recognize this deep-rooted nature. There's an interesting article I would draw everybody's attention to by a researcher from the London School of Economics, Andreas Rodriguez-Pozzi, who talks about the revenge of the places that don't matter. And in the article, the point is made that it's these marginal regions, these dark and forgotten places, are actually having their revenge, and have been for the past few years, through the political system. It's the Rust Belt in the USA voting for Donald Trump. It's the decaying working class towns of the UK voting for Brexit. And Sunderland, incidentally, very shamefully, was the first town in the UK to announce its leave decision with a majority of 61%. These are the places that express a sense of being disconnected. And this is where I want to pick up on what can be done with tourism in its very widest sense, at least to start to reconnect these places. So I guess the question becomes, how can we make the places that don't matter, matter? And for me, it's about finding and making connections. In some cases, however contrived these connections could be, and that's become a big part of my work over the past few years, and it's a very rewarding part. And it sort of underpins a sort of tourism that's not founded upon, developing USPs and highlighting difference, but rather one that finds links and similarities. I do a lot of work with the Council of Europe's Cultural Roots program, and what that taps into is a great many individuals and agencies actively looking for connections between places, and including those marginal places, those outlying places, in order for them to be connected and in some cases reconnected with one another. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in finding the things that connect us wherever we are. And in a sense, it's easier to find those connections and make those connections than ever before, because we have this thing called the internet, we have social media, and we make connections every day. We're making connections now. We can find historical connections, social and cultural connections, connections forged in trade, in migration, in language, in food, etc., and of course tourism. And revealing these connections opens new opportunities and provides what I think is a critical mass and some very real spaces where problems and stories can be shared. So if we return to this image, this top corner image that I put on a former slide, it's actually of a place called Burslem. Burslem is in the middle of England. It's part of the city of Stoke-on-Trent. And it is, again, a very dark and blighted place by any social or economic indicators you care to mention. Many people in the UK know very little about Burslem, but it has some important connections, and very interesting connections, and actually very relevant connections. The gentleman in the slide is Josiah Wedgwood. It was his birthplace. It was the birthplace of Josiah Wedgwood. Now, even if you haven't heard of Burslem, you may have heard of Wedgwood. You may have heard of Josiah Wedgwood. The sort of jasperware that was produced here and is still produced nearby. This is the birthplace of Josiah Wedgwood. The nearby factory is still producing Wedgwood pottery that most of us would recognize. And indeed, there are, I can't remember the exact figure, but in there are hundreds of Wedgwood collectors clubs around the world. You can find examples of Wedgwood in the museums across Europe. What's not so well known about Josiah Wedgwood, he was also a pioneer of modern marketing. He introduced things such as direct mail, shopping catalogues, very early shopping catalogues in the 18th century. The money-back guarantee was introduced by Josiah Wedgwood. And also, and I love this one, the buy one, get one free concept was something that Wedgwood actually was discussing in the late 18th century. Now, also, which again is a connection, Wedgwood's support for and work towards the abolition of slavery links him to historical figures such as William Wilberforce and also Benjamin Franklin, and I think provides a contemporary resonance. And it's through these stories, and this is what they are, they're stories, these are narratives. Burslem suddenly becomes an important place. It's a place which is still connected with the world, both in the past and in the present. It shares the story of pottery production, the craft and culture of making things. It even shares the story of decline and struggle. Stories that connect Burslem with places like Limoges in France, which again has similar sort of issues, Faenza in Italy, and Jingazhen, the birthplace of pottery and porcelain making in China. These connections, or some of these connections, are embodied in the European route of ceramics that was established in 2012 as through the Council of Europe's program, and it links 8 countries, but it remains largely unknown. And late last year, I visited Burslem, and in the course of a few meetings there, I was asking just about everyone, whether formally or informally, in the Costa coffee shop, in the entrance to the town hall, in the garage, I was asking about these Wedgwood connections. No one had heard of the ceramics route. Few people had thought that the Wedgwood factory had closed totally. Several people didn't even know there was a man called Josiah Wedgwood and what he'd done. And that just made me think, we're not sharing these connections. We're not sort of sharing these connections even within the communities that we work and live with. I was able to share my sort of admittedly limited knowledge of the extent of the connections. My wholly unscientific sample of people showed genuine interest in these connections, you know. And it's also an interest, and what was interesting as well, I took a party of Chinese professionals from Nanjing here, and we visited the Wedgwood factory, and I actually walked them through Burslem, and they didn't see the place that I saw. They didn't see the place that the local people saw. They saw these important connections, and I thought that's always an interesting and refreshing way to look at things. Very quickly, because I'm sure I'm running out of time here, Tara.
You've still got about 5 minutes.
Okay. I want to share you with you a project I've been involved with, and which, in a sense, although it seems conceptually a long way from the cases I've been sort of talking about, it's also about trying to make connections. And that's a project called the World Heritage Journeys of Europe. And it's still ongoing. It's been running since 2018. It's a cultural roots approach to tourism. It's about creating these narratives and making the connections in the very places where sometimes people don't even think there are connections. And essentially, it's a way to sort of thematically develop cultural tourism itineraries based upon European World Heritage sites. It needed to be, for lots of different purposes, genuinely transnational, thematically connecting the sites and regions in as many countries as possible. And I think at the moment we have about, I think there's 26 countries involved. And to support, and this is important, as far as possible, I'd come back to this as far as possible, lesser known World Heritage sites and associated local economies. And to stimulate these local economies through these branded themes and these narratives, these connections. The project has been undertaken by the Sustainable Tourism Programme, which I'm an advisor to in UNESCO. It's been funded by European Union. As any European project, and again, it's mentioned in the sort of the preamble of this thing, event, you know, Europe is dedicated to supporting market failure in the European Union. And in the main, it was targeted to the international tourist markets of China and North America, National Geographic's involved, etc. And our task was to come up with 4 themes based upon about 8 to 10 World Heritage sites. I have to say it's probably politically the most difficult project I've ever worked on, but that's another presentation. You can visit the website. You will see on this the 4 themed routes that we came up with: ancient Europe, romantic Europe, Royal Europe, underground Europe. You can look at those at your leisure. Just to finish with some sort of reflections, because I think there is a connection between this project and what I was talking about yesterday. It was very much sort of founded on the standing of the shoulder of giants approach, and my committed belief that World Heritage sites, you know, if they don't serve their local communities, they're no good whatsoever. This cultural roots work when sites and communities collaborate based on common connections. And it's about finding initially those common connections. And those connections and the narratives that we develop within this UNESCO project needed to have a balance between being distinctive and inclusive, but also being accessible. And yes, we were trying to bring in some of the lesser known regions surrounding some World Heritage sites. So the mining basin of northern France in Pas-de-Calais, which is, you know, was blighted for many years near places like Arras and Lens. So we were actively targeting the dark corners, but it's actually very difficult to exclude the bright lights. It takes time to get buy in and uncover these connections. And a question I would sort of throw out is, whose role is it to identify these connections? And I would say it's the researcher's role, it's the academic's role, it's the advisor's role. And in a lot of these cases, national and regional identity politics, which is the if you like, the antagonist. It's the revenge of some of these places are starting to get in the way, and particularly in these times, you know, we are retreating desperately into nationalisms and parochialisms, and we need to sort of make those general connections to make sense of our common cultures. So there we are. Thank you very much for bearing with me. I hope I didn't go over time too much.
Perfectly timed. Many thanks, Mike. Really, really interesting talk. I've taken lots of notes. What we will do is we'll move on to Karina and her chat. Her talk, and then we will come back for questions at the end. So for those of you who would like to ask questions, you can put them in the chat now if you'd like, and Elzbieta will keep track of them, or you can wait until Karina has also had a chance to present to see if there's any overlaps and ask questions then, and we'll look forward to a stimulating discussion shortly. So Karina, I'm glad we've managed to figure out your camera. It was never a good start to the morning, makes it a little bit stressful, but thank you for sorting it out. Yes. And I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. I surely for sure woke up here. So thank you very much for the organizers, EMBIS, and to Atlas for this kind invitation to do a pre-keynote. It's so good to, well, if not see, then sort of sense so many being present here today. And I'm really happy that you decided to move forward in these times. And I think in line with what Mike was saying before, that even though we feel like meeting and sharing, although the distance, it is actually really daunting to having to say something, to being asked to speak and say something in this time of crisis, in this time of uncertainty. And in times marked also by distance and by impeded collaboration and difficulties in working closely together. So also a question is, how can insights from the world of before, from before the pandemic and its global impacts contribute to moving forward and to think about tourism? And to be honest, I'm not quite sure. But I will, however, in this talk attempt in the following to offer an account of what I'd like to think of as more than tourism development. So the region where I draw the empirical examples has almost avoided COVID-19, at least directly, but is impacted even more so by other larger global crisis building, that of climate changes. So this place is the Arctic, and more specifically Greenland, where climate change is currently felt at double speed in comparison to elsewhere on the planet, and already now causing disruptions on landscapes, on species, and on everyday lives. I'm connected currently to a couple of projects that work with tourism development in the Arctic, the EU-funded Arctisan project developing cultural sensitivity in Arctic tourism, and also recently an Icelandic research project, Mobilities on the Margins, which work with creative processes of placemaking in rural subarctic Iceland. By focusing my discussion on Arctic tourism development in small communities, I wish to undertake a more than economic exploration of tourism development, and also discuss how we can learn from small-scale development. How can we learn bottom-up and from areas usually perceived as peripheral, as being on the margins? In telling about more than tourism development, I wish to provide a situated account of how tourism development is not something which is singular, and not something which can be identified as either an unequivocally good or bad, and of how tourism and its development is often about more than tourism. I think especially in these turbulent and uncertain times, and during times where the impacts and effects of halted travel so clearly distributes itself unevenly across the globe and within local societies, my account about tourism, and about what tourism is or can be, does not seek to offer solutions. Neither does it seem to offer critique from afar, but rather to proceed in ways that are ongoing, adaptive, tinkering, and open-ended, as described by Dutch thinker Anne-Marie Mott. In this tinkering with tourism and with tourism development, we zoom in on a destination which tourism marketing most often frame as remote and exotic last frontier, the Arctic destination of Greenland. So I don't have a PowerPoint, but I encourage you to Google and sense the way that Greenland is being marketed and positioned as this remote, isolated, and very natural and icy environment. However, while tourism numbers in the Arctic are still relatively low in comparison to other parts of the world, tourism has, well, up until recently, experienced unprecedented growth in Arctic regions. And Greenland is no exception to this trend. Successful marketing combined with a growing global interest in the Arctic has led to an increased amount of tourists to this, the world's largest island. In spite of less than 100,000 visitors a year, tourism is today proposed as one of Greenland's 3 economic pillars, next to fisheries and mining, and as a promising lever for the Arctic nation's future economic development. Geopolitically, and in the light of American President Trump's recent offer to buy Greenland from Denmark, this potential is of extra interest as the successful development of tourism paves the way for the Arctic nation's total independence from the Danish Commonwealth, under which it currently has self-rule. The global interest and growing numbers are reflected in the local rise in political and societal interest in tourism. Politicians and businesses are hoping and planning for substantial growth in tourism, as are some parts of its small coastal communities, making up the around 60,000 inhabitants of mostly Inuit descent. The wish by some for more tourism is further expected as 2 international airports are currently planned to open in 2022. The hopes, as well as concerns over how tourism will impact Greenland in the future, are unsurprisingly seeing its proximity to Iceland, only an hour of flight from the east coast of Greenland. Iceland has over the last decade witnessed an explosive intake of tourists and seen in the wake of this massive increase a fundamental recalking of its society, economy, and landscape. With while the 2 destinations are hardly comparable in terms of their tourism offer, their accessibility, infrastructure, or capacity, seeing the massive impacts that tourism has created on the neighboring nation triggers some reflections on the transformative capacity of tourism upon places as destinations. In his 2015 article, A Fish Called Tourism, Icelandic tourism researcher Gunnar Thor Johannesson almost prophetically warned an euphoric Icelandic tourism industry on the dangers of thinking about tourism as yet another business opportunity. In his account of how tourism emerged as a real business in Iceland, Johannesson describes how tourism was gradually taken up during the late 1990s as a solution to the continual crisis in the agricultural sector, with farmers being offered financial support to turn from farming sheep and cows to herding tourists. In parallel to this development, the Icelandic Tourist Board convincingly transferred a vocabulary of fisheries management to tourism, equating the export value of each tourist to a ton of cod, talking about tourism stock and depicting the airplanes of Iceland Air as trawlers. This, Johannesson argued, helped position tourism within an economic discourse as similar to and on par with fisheries and heavy industries. While such an approach helped policymakers and investors to recognize tourism as a real business, the problem is that a narrative framing tourism in terms of fisheries or similar extractive industries hides its complexity. Unlike fish, tourists do not stay in the oceans around Iceland, but get involved more profoundly with life on shore. In the context of tourism policy, it is important to acknowledge ways in which tourism activities become entangled with visitors' societies and environments, and to view tourism as more than just another industry, similar to that of fisheries, agriculture, or mining. As also argued by Australian tourism scholar Freya Higgins de Biol, tourism is not merely an industry, but also a social force with deep transformative capacities for societies, culture, and the planet. So for now, we've established tourism development as a more than economic force, a social force, or perhaps even a planetary force due to its Anthropocene implications. This view challenges tourism development as a straightforward, rational process of progress, and invites us instead to consider tourism as part of a much larger and much more complex process of worlding, of collaborative becoming. This attempt to revive and reinforce a wider vision of the role of tourism in local and earthly communities poses questions of how tourism as a social force could work or can work as a catalyst for change. For this present talk, question is specifically how tourism is mobilized in meaningful ways to engage with local challenges in the Arctic. Here, I'm cautious of not thinking about tourism development as a silver bullet, as a solution. This is inspired by the thinking of Donna Haraway, who encourages us to abstain from operating within binaries of hope and despair, of celebration and condemnation, in this case of tourism, and instead to stay with the trouble. To Haraway, this position entails a commitment to dwelling on that which is complex, unresolved, messy, controversial, or perhaps even uncomfortable, and to discard the idea of a possibility of choosing one good way over a bad one. It entails a commitment to staying with the gray zones, the murky and entangled middle ground. So I now turn to Greenland to exemplify how tourism is connected to societal challenges in the Arctic, and I hope more broadly to remote rural communities, and to how it might offer ways to rethinking tourism as something more than an industry. I illustrate and discuss three ways in which the development of tourism is linked to other societal concerns in the field also addressed by Mike Robinson of cultural heritage, within the field of education, and in the area of entrepreneurship. The examples stem from ongoing research on tourism development in Greenland and draws on fieldwork, interviews, workshop activities with tourism stakeholders in Greenland, conducted together with PhD student Daniela Kimeri. Thank you. We first find a powerful example of how tourism is connected to current societal change and concerns in the area of cultural heritage. Dog sledge and kayaks are less and less used for their original hunting purposes in Greenland, partially because of climate changes, which have changed previous patterns of sea ice and access to open sea. However, local knowledge about them still exists. Also, tourist interest in experiences such as dog sledge and kayak tours and kayak building is increasing. At a visit to a UNESCO World Heritage Site of the Ilulissat Ice Fjord, its site manager noted the rising interest in Greenlandic kayaks, and I quote, "There are people who travel from all over the world and want to do workshops on how to build a Greenlandic kayak. Now we can use this interest in building your own kayak and do offers here in Greenland." The quote shows how tourism is part of reactivating tradition through emerging business opportunities created within tourism. It is also connected to community collaboration, for instance, in integrating local knowledge into tourism products and experiences. By becoming part of tourism activities and a potential business, local knowledge is not only mobilized, but also activated into the sustaining and reconceptualization of cultural heritage. But while tourism may play a crucial role in potentially reactivating local and indigenous knowledge and practices, new and emerging questions emerge around, for instance, safety and certification. A local tourism actor explains this in this way. and I quote, "Locals are more than qualified to take people out on the sea, but the problem is that they are not certified as sea kayak instructors, even though they know more about the kayak than the Spanish instructors we currently have." While official certification might function to assure the tourist of the highest degree of safety, which naturally is of utmost importance in Arctic sea waters, integrating local knowledge, which has been passed down from generation to generation as informal, but of course uncertified skills, and integrating that into certification schemes is not without difficulty. Right now, I'm afraid there is no time to go into the intricacies of certifying local knowledge, but the account touches on the role of tourism in reactivating cultural heritage, as well as the need to develop a framework which acknowledges and integrates informal knowledge and its anchoring in local cultural heritage, but can also respond to standardized requirements. So that was the first example. I think the challenge of certification also intersects with general concerns regarding the educational sector in Greenland, where only 25% of the population graduates from high school and little over 10% receive a college degree. According to one tourism stakeholder, and I quote, "One of the toughest societal challenges in Greenland is education. We definitely need to have more people educated. Education is our guiding star right now. It has been for years, and it will be for years. We have to do that in collaboration with companies and municipalities, with everybody." Another tourism actor supports this by saying that education is the main challenge of all. We've been talking about tourism, the overall infrastructure, but one of the biggest challenges is education. That is something we can agree upon in the whole of the country. In an attempt to address growing needs for an educated workforce in tourism, a vocational school in South Greenland now offers programs in Arctic and adventure guiding and in hospitality and tourism management. Several informants from the public and private sector point to a climbing number of graduates, and as an example, showcasing the interest in this field. According to a teacher, it is also, and I quote, "a very popular education, attracting quite many, and they all go out and find a job in tourism after they finish their studies." In tourism, workforce training, raising awareness of the role and reactivation of local knowledge and informal acquired skills intersect with the crafting of new educational opportunities, while at the same time stimulating the interest in attaining post-secondary education, which is of a general societal concern. Seeing and talking of tourism as an industry easily overlooks the connections between developing tourism, raising, in this case, the national educational level, and providing attractive educational and training opportunities for the young generation in small communities. By linking the development of tourism to issues of education, we see its ability to supplement existing educational offerings and contribute to future educational groundings as new career opportunities and paths in tourism open themselves up to new groups of young people in small and rural communities. A last example to illustrate the relationship between tourism development and other societal concerns is entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is increasingly recognized on a global scale as an important factor in developing societies and in developing tourism. The last decade has witnessed an increasing focus on developing strategies for entrepreneurship education in a Nordic context, for instance. In Greenland, however, limited experience has been made in this area. Greenland currently does not have a national strategy or national goals for entrepreneurship education, no ministry involvement, or any national definition. In spite of a lack of governmental strategy, Greenlandic tourism actors at a local scale point to an increased interest in entrepreneurship, linking this to emerging opportunities created through the intensification of tourism. Tourism entrepreneurs in Greenland are typically small, often seasonal initiatives offering services or products such as equipment, souvenirs, food products, or excursions. Tourism actors identify entrepreneurship in tourism as a potential lever for lifting Greenlandic businesses and communities. As stated by a tourism actor in Greenland, we see more and more people getting into the tourism business, taking the guide education, and we hear about people who are thinking of starting something new in Greenland, which is positive. With communities with high unemployment or a high dependency on the fishing industry, creative businesses within food, arts, nature, and culture not only diversify the economy, but also recreates places and develops communities through these sorts of entrepreneurship activities. Developed collaboratively, tourism holds the potential to inspire new ways of thinking about and engaging with local challenges. Emerging local tourism initiatives show that education, entrepreneurship, and community development are not issues separate from tourism, but are rather, as shown in these examples, intrinsically linked to them. It also suggests that new opportunities in each of these areas can be co-developed rather than grappled with separately in silos. In comparison to fisheries, currently comprising more than 85% of the economy, and the so far unfulfilled promises of large-scale mining, tourism on a smaller scale cannot compete in Greenland, at least as an economic factor, as an industry. Seen, however, as a more than economic force and planned with local concerns and resources in mind, tourism has much to offer to local communities, for instance, in revaluing and activating cultural heritage, in assisting in recognizing and certifying local, often informal knowledge, raising the level of education, and stimulating and facilitating entrepreneurial activities. In conclusion, the story about tourism development in Greenland helps expand our current understanding of tourism in an Arctic setting, where communities live with the impacts of climate change and growing visitor numbers. It does so by showing how the work with tourism in a local context is connected with other societal concerns. First, preserving and reactivating heritage, getting more young people in educations, and seizing and developing entrepreneurship. Second, it shows us that tourism development should be seen as more than tourism development, entangled as it is into other spheres of the social, into other societal concerns. Developing tourism, or tourism worlding, is intrinsically linked to and co-constructed with the multitude of practices usually perceived as outside of tourism. Lastly, it shows that there are no quick fixes. In the tourism landscape portrayed by informants in Greenland, it's difficult to pinpointing unambiguously good or entirely bad solutions. There's no closure on the ground, only careful and ongoing threading where things are sometimes given or won, but also sometimes taken and lost. Together, these insights inform us of tourism development as a distributed, complex, and never-ending story. One that is world-making and collaborative, and one which can ultimately develop things to be different. And perhaps such modest insights can contribute to move forward in developing tourism in, with, and for communities. Thank you.
Many thanks, Karina. Another really interesting talk. Thank you. Okay, so the rest of the session for about the next half an hour is so that we can have some questions and discussion around both Mike and Karina's talks today. Now, I just need to remind everyone of GDPR. We would like you to ask your question if you are willing to. However, if you would prefer not to be on the recording because this is being recorded, then please do just type your question in either to everybody or to Ambis Alsbieta, and we can make sure that it's asked. So if I can ask you to start thinking about questions. I know Robert Pettersson at ETOR had one. Robert, if you're willing, I'm wondering whether you might be able to ask Mike your question.
Yes, thank you, Tara. I got nothing to hide, so I put on my camera as well. And thank you, Tara. And thanks to Atlas for making this meeting possible. I'm looking forward to meet with all of you in real life. Thanks also to Mike and for a very good presentation. Very nice pictures, by the way. I had a question or maybe a reflection connected to what you said about what we really could expect from tourism. The E2 Research Center here at the Mid-Sweden University did a case study in the mountain region of Jämtland in northern Sweden. And we interviewed all 9 municipalities and all the DMOs and a large number of other stakeholders regarding tourism and regional development. And it came to our conclusion that these tourist stakeholders stated that we should have rather big expectations on tourism that reaches beyond guest nights and job occupations for tourism entrepreneurs. They also pointed out what tourism meant in their destinations for other complex societal challenges, such as public health, where trails and ski lifts and other touristic infrastructure encourages active lifestyle. They pointed out integration, talking about connections, and they also talked about identity and local proudness that in the end made people, the locals, to stay on and wanted to stay on and live in that region, but also did attract people to move to these places and destinations. And that was sort of my reflection. I would say my conclusion is that we should have rather big expectations on tourism, and maybe we have counted too many guest nights for too many years. And since we are still waiting for Swedish to become a world language, we have so far only published this in Swedish, but there is a report on the E2 website, and this says tourism and its role for regional development, a case from the region of Jämtland. So at least the ones speaking Scandinavia can have something out of this. So that was my reflection. So thank you very much.
Okay, if I can, thank you very much, Robert. I mean, it was a very pertinent reflection. And I agree with this notion that tourism should be thought of as something in a much wider context. And, you know, the volume and value arguments that used to be made about tourism, I think are starting to decline, and people are starting to see, and Karina used the term world making, the benefits of the social interaction, the benefits of just sort of, you know, basic human connections, which is something I was trying to get at, I think are starting to show through. And yes, in terms of, for instance, in terms of how this can have knock-on effects to public health, I work, you know, with various heritage projects trying to use heritage in a sort of a recuperating way, sort of using museum objects for dementia patients, etc., etc. There's lots of other things that connect all these other policy sectors. So I am fully, you know, I'm fully on side with the point you're making, and I'd certainly like to find out more about. I don't think I'll learn Swedish, but anyway, I would certainly like to find out more about what you've done. When you ask about the levels of complexity, and the complexity has these multi-layers, because what's complex to some places and not complex to other places. And I guess what I was getting at is the sort of the, you know, in places where tourists don't even go now, you know, so you can't have this policy integration, because tourism, how do you solve, if we talk about complex problems, 3 generations of unemployment, you know, record levels of obesity, you know, education, which the standards of education in some places are absolutely, you know, frightening. So, but in order to do that, we've got to break through to have that connection. You know, you have to get the tourists there. You know, you have to get that sort of that policy forum in place and fight. That's why I think starting with basic human connections, I think is something that we need to be thinking about. It's stepping back a bit further, I think, from what you're saying. But I can't argue with the premise, and like I say, I'd be very interested to learn more about the work that you've been doing in the Mid-Sweden area.
Thank you.
Yeah, and following up, I mean, I totally agree on this idea of getting a better understanding of the distributed both effects of tourism, but also how it can contribute to social development. I think in understanding the pressure, so not only counting bed nights, but also looking at the pressures on sewage or roads or hospitals when we think about what are the impacts of tourism, but also perhaps in what Mike was talking about how it has placemaking effects or can change discourses about places. And this worlding, like how does it actually has much larger repercussions. So I think having a distributed understanding, but also a situated understanding of how, of course, this doesn't develop in the same ways across the globe or across societies, that there are also differences. But I think having a better understanding of impacts and effects of tourism is a conversation that is building. And I think this is a really good example, Robert, of understanding how tourism links to other activities and other spheres. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you.
Thank you very much. The next question came from René. So René, can you ask the question?
Hi, good morning. First, I have a very actually practical question to Mike Robinson. Recently, I was approached by people who wanted to set up a new cultural route in Europe. And I was wondering what the connection is between your World Heritage journeys and the cultural routes in Europe, if there are connections and to what extent they strengthen each other or not.
Thank you, René. No, there is no connection. The Council of Europe program is very specific. As you know, it's been running since 1997. And it has a very formulaic, process-driven, validated way of validating and evaluating, constant evaluation of cultural routes. The UNESCO project sort of borrowed a little bit, let's say, from the methodology, but it stopped short. It was very much a top-down rather than a sort of a bottom-up project. And because it only focuses upon World Heritage sites, UNESCO World Heritage sites, it's been directed through the Sustainable Program at the World Heritage Center in Paris. So there is a sort of a conceptual connection, but not a practical connection. And I work with a foot in both camps, and so. I try to bring harmony, but sometimes, there's in some ways they're two different animals. So.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And I have another question for Karina, maybe also a practical question, but listen to your story, and of course I understand the argument that tourism development is very much connected to other spheres of life, like in this case entrepreneurship or cultural heritage. But just in the case of Greenland, isn't the question posed, or should the question be posed, should we start with tourism at all, in light not only of the current pandemic, but also climate change, the economic crisis we will. So are there alternatives for other sectors, to put it that way, to fulfill the same role as tourism is doing? Is that question posed? I think it's a political question, which should be answered on a political level. But is that discussed at all, or should it be discussed at all? Yeah,
and I think it's a very good question, and something which I've also grappled with and discussed with people in Greenland. And I think it shows us on a more general level the paradoxes of sustainable development. That what looks unsustainable on a global level, on a local level is the most sustainable choice. So it's a question of scale. In Greenland, the choice is develop or not to develop, what should be instead. In this case, many are looking to developing extractive industries, so mining, in many cases also the extraction of uranium. So would we rather develop our local communities through large-scale mining projects with the severe impacts that can have on the environment and on small communities, which is known in other places such as Canada, Australia, etc. Or should we develop tourism, and on which scale? Should it be large or mass scale Arctic tourism, like we're seeing in the north of Finland, for instance, in northern Norway, or should it be community based? So this is an ongoing discussion. So of course, if you talk about climate change, again, we have the paradox of going to Greenland necessitates, if not sailing, then flying, which we know, of course, accelerates climate change, and Greenland being, or the Arctic regions being heavily impacted by climate change. Of course, we can see the paradox unfolding before our eyes. But from a local perspective, it's about choices, like, or even what should we live off in the future for these small communities? And the choice is limited. And I think it's maybe sometimes the choice between different kinds of evils. And also, again, it's a political question, because Greenland would like to become, most people in Greenland would like to become independent from Denmark. And the only way to become so is through economic development. So there's also other things that are also important. Yeah, paradoxes of sustainability right there.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
We have no more questions here, so if you would like to ask some more questions, please do not hesitate.
Maybe as chair, I can take the advantage, and Mike, really interesting, and coming from Leicester in the UK myself, even though I'm now based in Sweden, made me really think about what's going on in local communities, and especially with your work with the cultural roots now. Where do you see this going in the future? The current pandemic in the UK, the isolations and lockdowns. Are having more impact on communities, and how communities are coming together or in some ways falling apart. So I just wondered if you could maybe reflect on if we ever see whatever the other side of this pandemic is, what might happen then.
That's just a nice straightforward question, Tara, you know, so
sorry about that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think what's happened is we have to look at the cumulative effect of this pandemic, and you know, some of the economic and social problems that affect, you know, many places, not just in the UK but everywhere in the world, have just been accentuated. You know, I would like to think in optimistic vein, you know, that, and again, I personally moved from the sort of the incredibly optimistic to the incredibly pessimistic very quickly in these cases. You know, I'd like to think that this pandemic has made us think about our humanity, about what connections we do share, about what futures we could create in a sort of a brave new world scenario. And then I moved to the fact that, you know, we're all, you know, instinctively we tend to sort of retract into our own identities and our own locations and become very protective. And then, you know, so it's, you know, and of course, every situation, every place is dealing with the pandemic in different ways. And, you know, there was a lockdown, total lockdown in Leicester not that long ago. But how that sort of works out in terms of tourism in the future, well, again, you know, for places like, you know, and I'm not denigrating Leicester in the same way I'm not denigrating anywhere else, but, you know, you know, there's not going to be a resurgence of tourists massively pouring into Leicester post-pandemic. You know, it's going to be more or less the same with all of its deep-rooted social and economic problems. And I think it's, you know, it's with us. The pandemic is with us. We have to deal with it. And but when it goes, hopefully, you know, when a vaccine comes along and we're back to normal, we go back to normal with the other things as well. And I'm not sure that there's much of a relationship. I don't think there'll be much of a sort of a response to this. And yeah, it's a tough one, but I have no crystal ball, I'm afraid.
I don't think anyone does at the moment, do they? Karina?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this about what are the most resilient ways to work through this, and I don't have answers at all, but I have, I mean, having talked to DMOs and looking to what DMOs are doing in these northern and Arctic areas, where we can see that the businesses, as I was also talking about, are smaller and often also very diversified, which have made them resilient in this time, because the ability to sort of like a jack of all trades to shift into a different mode or a different gear. So having fishing and hunting, some subsistence economy, and you have some tourism activities. Maybe you also have a part-time job in the care sector or the public sector. So it hasn't been hit so massively. And so I think that and at the same time, the national DMOs have also worked with this. I mean, this is something you all recognize, this staycation or nearcation, having like this local turn. So how can we actually look at our home market as potential visitors? So we've actually seen a huge campaign in Greenland for Greenlanders. I mean, it's not nearcation. So even though it's staycation, it's still a huge country. But actually for people to rediscovering places that they've never been to, because before that, going on holiday was always going outside of Greenland. So there is actually has been this local initiative to develop products and services for Greenlandic tourists, which I think has also been a place of learning. So there are learnings taking place about I think also the resilience of small scale business development, and on thinking about local markets also as potential more than it has been before. And I'm thinking, Mike, perhaps that could also be the case in not at all similar places, but how do we address this for a local market or for local potential visitors?
Yes, you just made me think there, Karina, about I mean, I'm involved with a project now, and I for various reasons I can't mention the places, but in this time when nobody can travel, I'm working with a group, a community who are trying to sell their souvenirs, their crafts online to a global market, because there's nobody coming to their place, to their sites. But what they have been doing is trying to develop online marketing and online sales. So even though you can't go there and pick up your souvenir, virtually they can. So they are, we are working on a whole system of postage and packaging and, certificates of authenticity, etc., etc. So again, in terms of resilience, it's and trying to sort of do something differently. They're not just sitting there waiting for the tourists to come to buy their trinkets and their handicrafts. They're actively now working, and we're working with them to sort of to reach out to the community and get these things sent through the post. So again, very simple example of what you do in these very strange times. You adapt, you have to diversify, and but you still have to think, and this is really important, you still have to think globally. because some days everything will return.
Thank you. Yes. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Karina. We do have one more question from Christina, and she asks a much more general question, and she opens it to the floor, to everybody, as well as Mike and Karina. How can destinations in the Global South meet the Sustainable Development Goals without basing their sustainable strategies exclusively on economic growth and profitability? Can sustainability and growth be compatible? Maybe I could ask Mike and Karina to start, and then we can open up and see if anyone else has a comment.
Well, I think with the question also posed by Renee just before about whether tourism in an Arctic environment is sustainable at all, should it be developed, shows, you know, as I was saying, the paradoxes of sustainability and how maneuvering on different scales. So looking at sustainability in a community or micro perspective, and looking into it from a macro perspective, gives us different views, different insights, and also different answers to what we should and can do. So I mean, I'm not willing to give a straight answer to whether sustainability and growth can be compatible. Only point to the fact that what looks as a good choice on a local from a local perspective might not be so in a wider perspective, and vice versa. And I think that was the point I was trying to make about this staying with the trouble perspective, that there is not one solution. Don't develop, or you should develop. Growth is the answer. Growth is not the answer. It depends, and sometimes these are incompatible depending on from which level of which perspective you're trying to look at it from. But I'm quite humbled by being in Greenland and trying to be all globally aware about climate change, and having people in small communities saying, look, for us it's a choice about staying in this place or moving, or seeing my kids move. So if we want to stay, if we want to have a place here in the future, we need to do something, even though you might not think that that it's good for climate change, right? So there are many different interests that we need to balance, and I think as researchers we need to stay humble to looking at these local concerns, and thinking about what are the best possible ways to move forward in developing these communities.
I mean, there's very little I can add to that what Karina has said, and again, it's not an either or question. What I would say, just to develop a little bit further, is that for me, the important thing is ask the communities. You know, we need to have a system of governance which is actually, you know, get some consensus about what is actually wanted. And we need to have the facts of what, as best we can, in terms of what the implications of our decisions are. And you know, I've worked in places around the world where, you know, I've been told to go into places and say, look, you know, you need to develop tourism, and local communities said, well, we don't want to develop tourism, you know, we want to do something else. And you know, you have to respect, and you have to factor in that decision-making process into the governance of a project or the governance of a decision. So, you know, there are no easy wins in the sort of with the Sustainable Development Goals. It's always a case of trade-offs. Some of those trade-offs are very political. But unless you know, I'm a firm believer that you have to first ask the communities that are affected what they actually want, and try and work to that, and explain to them as much as possible, and try and engage them as much as possible on what are the implications of any decisions, whichever way they decide. So again, it's, you know, it's a massive question, Christina, thank you, but I don't think there's any sort of, you know, particular side you would come out on. You would have to sort of look at the this in a much more detailed way.
And I think we could hold a session just talking about the paradoxes and intricacies and challenges of it in itself. Thank you both, Mike and Karina. Have we got any more questions?
No.
Thanks, Elzbieta. I was just thinking that, Karina, you used the word humble, and we've sort of talked about the sort of hopeful tourism, aspirational aspects of tourism. Both Mike and Karina, you've both sort of talked about potentials and sort of how we as researchers perhaps can interact with communities. Karina, I think your example just now of the community saying, well, we have to do these things because we want to stay or we want our children to stay. And this is sort of more just a discussion point, but I wondered where sort of as researchers, our positivity or our hopefulness, how you think that actually relates to sort of the on the ground realities of the communities you're talking to, Karina, and Mike, perhaps some of the work that you're doing with the UN and the cultural roots and through the European Commission.
Mike?
Thank you, Karina. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think what comes across in Karina's work, and I hope, well, I know it comes across in my work, I hope, is that as researchers, we have to get our hands dirty. We have to go into communities. We have to work with communities. We have to be involved in the co-production of knowledge, and that's the exciting bit. You know, as researchers, that's the real exciting bit, but it's also the challenging bit. Because people tell you things that you don't particularly want to hear, and a lot of the times that you don't need to know sometimes. But I don't think I've ever got such a buzz of working out of my work than working with communities and working with local people. Where you find these, and I come back to the word, you find these connections. You know, people genuinely pick up on things and they say, yeah, that's us, you know. And sometimes it does take an outsider, you know, it does take an outsider to come and have a purview, a more panoramic view of what's actually happening and where places are. And I think that's the job of the researcher, you know, is to genuinely share the knowledge. It's not just to take, you know, give me lots of information so I can go and write my article, you know, but what I can give back, what I can share about what's happening in other places. And if we need that more than ever, you know, as I say, because sadly, I think, you know, the borders literally are closing, you know. And I can share examples of my work either in the Far East or the Middle East, you know, I'm sure with, you know, and you know, I've worked in parts of Scandinavia, you know, and people say that's really happening because we all share the same problems, you know. So I think it's the job of the researcher to be the spreader of these knowledges, to look for these connections. And also sometimes to be the translator, you know, not the linguistic translator, but the translator within, from culture to culture, from scenario to scenario. So, yeah, but it does raise a lot of problems, and, you know, there are ethical issues involved and a whole raft of things, but I see it as my job. I hope everybody sees it as their job.
To me, it's I think boiling it down to what is tourism. To me as a researcher, I see it like this caring for tourism and not caring in the, you know, seeing it as this hope, but on the other side, as I was saying before, not to see despair, but looking at tourism like a friend, you know, this complicated friend who's like someone you care deeply for, but who also has lots of flaws. And to not think that, again, it's a silver bullet that developing tourism can solve so it might solve some issues or some problems, but it also creates some at this. And I think it's about this ambiguity, about this messiness. So last year we were talking about over tourism. Now we're talking about under tourism. So and not thinking that we will ever be able to find that that point that is perfect. But to keep going together with tourism. So not saying we don't want tourism or tourism is the answer, but to try to, yeah, I like this caring for tourism, like this complicated but great friend. And this is how I think about my implication into tourism, not coming with my ideas of what it should be, but to stay with it and to listen and to have this conversation. So I've never actually before just now thought about tourism as my complicated friend, but I think that might be how I would think about it from now on. Yeah.
It's a great metaphor. I like. I might be stealing that from you, Karina. It's a great one. Thank you. Thank you, Mike and Karina. I think those last points really emphasize how important our engagement with local communities, with NGOs, with tourism businesses, with government are. So thank you both. I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking Mike and Karina for taking the time out and talking to us today. Unfortunately, we can't be in Prague, but hopefully we will see them next year. So please keep an eye on the Atlas webpage, and hopefully Ambus will be able to host some sort of conference next year, and Mike and Karina can come along and talk to us then. So thank you both. Thank you to Ambus for co-hosting this with Atlas. We have got a series of events throughout the rest of the week, so please do check out those. They are on our website. Thanks to those behind the scenes in Atlas for registering everyone and organizing it. And I think I can say that from me and from everyone, thank you very much. Goodbye, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you very much. Also, goodbye, and well, I hope to see you in Prague next year.
Thanks, Albieta.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.